we saw in the end of the Second World War an overall reduction. There's a great graph I can send you about, how overall war has gone down. But, after the event with Ukraine, we're seeing a reversion of that, an overall disruption and perpetual instability becoming the norm again.
I think we recorded last about a year and a half ago. So it's been a while, but you've grown tremendously in popularity on social media, and you have a really awesome podcast and YouTube channel that has like more than 10,000 subscribers. Actually, I watch a lot of your YouTube content because you always have like super fascinating perspectives, like very credible practitioners. And then obviously, as a reminder for anybody that hasn't seen you on my platform in a while, you did your MA at SACE. You've got like a very multicultural perspective. You're a world traveler and you are a political analyst. So Piotr, I think the topic that I want to talk to you about today, and we can catch up for a second too, but I want to talk to you about Ukraine and Russia. But, if there's anything else that you've been thinking about or working on, we can discuss that too.
Yeah, it sounds good. It's nice to be back. Thanks for the shout outs. Yeah, we just surpassed 10K on YouTube, which is, I mean, I could have done it sooner probably, but I'm pretty laid back, a bit lazy. And I don't post as much as I should. But I'm also beginning to incorporate some of my own content into the videos. It's mainly been me speaking to other people, but well, the audience want to hear my thoughts. And I did a short on Sweden, which people really liked. I mean, it was really weird actually. I was going to the gym, so I was there in like a tank top and sports shorts and stuff, and then Sweden like joins NATO, and I was like, oh, I should definitely do a short on this because it will be like reactionary and I can jump on the intrigue and no. So I made a short in sports
Yeah,
gear and everyone was like, "Why are you in like?" I was like, "Yeah, it's so doing more of that." But it's been fun and
that's fine.
lots of exciting things for 2024.
A lot of people don't know this, so we'll remind them. But you actually ran like one of the most popular continuous streams at the start of the Ukraine-Russia conflict that had over 1 million plus people attend and probably more than that talking about it. Now we're, just over 2 years into the war. What is your perspective on Russia and Ukraine at this moment?
Oh, yay. A lovely, small, specific question to start with. Yeah, I mean, the room was, for people who don't know, yeah, it was the Ukraine sit rep room. It was like a 24-hour broadcast on like a radio station sort of thing. And we reached like 2 million people over 110 days. And it was very impactful. Actually helped to get some people out, get some funding to different parts of the country, like humanitarian, donations, that sort of thing. So that was pretty cool. But the war really is, it's really tough to be honest with you because I have a very personal connection to this, and it makes that difficult for me to dissect and detach my personal views or personal connections to what I think professionally, if that makes sense. I also get a lot of shtick from people on both sides because I try to be balanced or moderate. The same as Israel Gaza, as we'll cover later, although that's less difficult for me because I'm not as personally attached. But let's I think it's worth taking stock of what this war means and where it came from. I'm not going to get into the debate about, who was ultimately at fault, but when the 2 year anniversary happened, what, last week, I made a quick video, and the main point I was trying to get across in that video was that no one wins in this war. As soon as a war happens, everybody's lost. And I really don't like the way that people sometimes deliberately frame it as like, well, who's winning? No one's winning, guys. Tens of thousands of people have been killed, um, displaced, hundreds of thousands, let's be honest, We have no idea. Ukraine is never going to be the same again. Now we've got parts of Russia that are experiencing attacks from Ukrainian drones and just other instabilities. You know, he had attempted mutiny last year with Wagner Group. So both countries are suffering. And, you know, for context, my grandmother, my father's mother's side, comes from the Donbass. She's got, I think, Don Cossack heritage, if I remember what my father's told me. So I have Russian connections, but connections also to a part of a country that is now Ukraine, right? And this whole dispute over the territories and ultimately who identifies with what country is part of the problem, or one of the biggest contributions to this whole situation. So for me, it's pretty tough to sort of just to look at it very quickly and be like, oh well, we're like this. Personally, I think to be realistic, one side was always going to be seen as the more favourable side of this, right? In the sense of who was more likely to come out on top. Russia surprised us all in that it wasn't able to just steamroll Ukraine and force the resignation of Zelensky and install a more pro-Russian government. Right? There's debate about what the original objectives were of the Russians, but in my mind, it was to make Ukraine more favorable towards Russia. Ukraine has been a country in a tug of war between West and East, or NATO/EU, and Russia. And prior to 2008 and a few other developments, Ukraine was quite neutral. There were statements that were made that said Ukraine was quite happy to be like Austria, right? Austria of the eastern part of Europe, or of Eurasia. Now you can debate again; it's all debatable, but that sort of, and so I think that Putin wanted to try to create a sort of Belarus version of Ukraine, in that he installs a government that is much more pro him. It gives him more space between Eastern Ukraine, Eastern Europe, NATO, and Russia. And also, he controls by default there 100% the Black Sea. It fits into every aspect. When it became apparent that the Ukrainians weren't just going to be steamrolled, he adjusted, and he's focusing on Novorossiya, which is the new Russia, the part of Ukraine, eastern, southern, specifically Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Odessa Oblast, largely speaking, and Kherson. Those five main oblasts, you can debate again specific details, but these five oblasts largely made up what was known as New Russia, and it was when the Russian Empire controlled it in the late 1800s. And then it changed, obviously, when the Soviet Union appeared, and part of that land was given to Ukraine when it was the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic between 1919 and 1922, 3. And then it was obviously absorbed into Soviet Union proper, and then got its independence in 91. But this kind of area, so Putin is now focusing on this area. And if you look at a map of where Russia largely controls the territory that it has gained since, it largely falls in line with that. And also because it neatly connects up to Transnistria, which is this area, tiny slither of land in Moldova, which wants to be part of Russia. So, and then it cuts off Ukraine from the Black Sea and turns it into what's known as a rump state. You know, what Hungary sort of will remain, Bulgaria, in historic after the First World War, I think, if I remember correctly, right? Basically, it's a much smaller state with much less economic power, much less land, much less access to certain areas like the sea or whatever. And so Putin wants to ultimately weaken Ukraine if he can't control it entirely via, you know, a puppet government or a client state kind of scenario. So that's what I think he's doing. Are we there now? So just to be very quick on what the situation is now, I'm going to say that I don't follow the intricate daily developments on the military battlefield. I'm more the bigger picture, grand strategy sort of element. So, you know, the loss of Avdiivka is a significant loss, but it didn't come at at no loss to the Russians. It's a Pyrrhic victory, right? And therefore, you know, people will be like, well, it's absurd to say that Ukraine is winning. Again, Ukraine isn't winning, but the fact that they're still stalling the Russians is in itself quite impressive. Of course, that comes at the
Sure.
support of American and Western equipment and funding, but it's ultimately now, I think, you know, we all want this war to come to an end, and I'm no different. I don't support boys and young men going to war. No one does of any reasonableness.
mm,
But what I think is problematic is to simply think like people like David Sachs or other people on Twitter when
mm,
they say that if you just allow Russia and Ukraine to negotiate, that will somehow mean that this doesn't happen again. The problem is that you give Russia what it wants in parts of the territories. Okay, fine. But that means Ukraine is smaller. Ukraine is now highly securitized. You've got a huge amount of land that is filled with mines, so the Russians can't even use it. And the whole thing's just a mess. And all that does is embolden other countries that want to do the might is right mentality, right? Which is you can use
sure.
hard power, kinetic force to get what you want. The Azerbaijanis have been doing
Mm,
it more and more in Armenia. We've got, other countries around the world considering doing this. It makes us see an end to what's known as the peace dividend, which again, this isn't a defense like the West is suddenly the arbitrator of all peace. That's not, of course not. The illegal war in Iraq, Afghanistan, no one's Kosovo, even Somalian terrible wars of the 1990s in Somalia, Amisom. No one's denying any of that. But what this does do is, and this is the last point because I know I said a lot, which is that it ultimately ends the peace dividend. This idea that wars, at least between great powers, Russia, China, America, India, whoever, are no longer not as likely, right? We saw in the end of the
sure.
Second World War an overall reduction. There's a great graph I can send you about, how overall war has gone down. Depends on the type of war.
Sure.
But, after the event with Ukraine, we're seeing a reversion of that, an overall disruption and perpetual instability becoming the norm again. So,
Mm.
yeah. I know I didn't probably answer your question very well,
Yeah.
but I hope it makes sense.
No, you did. This is awesome. And speaking of David Sachs, who's a friend of one of my friends, okay, Jason Kalkinis. So I can't talk too heavy about David, but I do think he is representing this kind of like emergence of like Russian sympathy on the right in American politics. And, this is also starting to make its way into Congress, which, I mean, maybe 6, 8 months ago was maybe a more minority wing of the Republican Party. And it's spreading where Republican Congress people are more frequently calling for this end of this war uh, in Ukraine and to cease funding Ukraine. And then, you have Robert Kennedy Jr., who's running as an independent.
Mm.
And he also seems to have this kind of sympathetic Russian idea in his rhetoric. Uh, so, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that there's no way that Ukraine could defend itself without military hardware and financial support from the United States. But I mean, what are your thoughts on what the United States' role is in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah. So just before I answer that, I want to just clarify as well that again, when I'm saying all this, I'm not naive or ignorant to the realism of the war. Put it this way, right? I obviously Russia is if you give enough, if time is limitless and this becomes a forever war, a frozen conflict, a war, a protracted war, then sure, the Russians will probably eventually just win because they've got more people. When Russia's it tripled its wartime budget from 59 billion to now about 150 billion dollars, right? That's Russia is really putting all of its emphasis on ammunitions production, and they are able to produce more stuff than the West in many assets, right? And ultimately, they have much more symbolic and historical interest in Ukraine in this part of the world than the West will ever fully. But that doesn't mean I support
Mm,
the loss of sovereignty and forced capitulation of an entire country, right? Just because I can acknowledge the limitations of the Ukrainians versus the Russians or whatever it is, doesn't mean that I think that it's right what Russia, what Putin is trying to achieve. If you want to have those the Ukrainian parts of Ukraine join Russia, hold a referendum. right? Encourage there to be a referendum and get the UN or an independent party to do it, and then see, right, okay, do you want to join this or that? And I think people deliberately conflate and think when I'm like, well, I don't think Ukraine should be taken over by Russia. They're like, oh, so you think Ukraine can win? Well, that's a different question, and also a deliberately misleading one because you're trying to sort of point out that people who support Ukraine or are against Putin's actions are somehow stupid, right? It's not about that. Those are two different points, and this gross simplification of the
Sure.
matter is a deliberate, red herring that people bring in because it plays into the narratives and the points. But to America's role, let me get it out of the way very clearly and quickly, which is I fully appreciate and frankly stand by people who want to focus on their domestic issues. The southern border in America is a real problem. I've been down there partially in a professional capacity, but because I was just curious. And, it was bad when I went down there, and that was 2020, 21, right? Or whatever, a couple of years before now, the massive, massive influx that you've got going on. And I completely understand people's sentiments when they're struggling with homelessness, they're struggling with paying the bills, there's issues going on in the American economy. And all this money that could be put towards these domestic issues is being sent overseas to an issue that, to quote, people who say that it's not our problem, sort of thing. I completely understand that point. The problem is with, I think it's also a spectrum because there are people who want to support Ukraine, but maybe not to such an extent. And then there are maximalist people who don't want to do anything, the isolationists of the world. And it's these kinds of individuals that are just, they don't understand that. Well, David is an example. I'm sorry to call him out, but he is. And
Sure.
Trump is another example in that isolationism as a grand strategy, foreign policy doesn't work. Do you really think that by isolating and only focusing on yourself and not doing anything to do with international affairs, that means that suddenly you won't still be interfered with by other countries? No. Just because let's do a hypothetical, right? America's like, okay, Trump wins. Okay, America's going to pull out of Ukraine. We're going to stop supplying. Okay, right, you can do that. It will end with, Ukraine probably having to give up some of those territories and the Europeans taking up the mantle. And I fully agree that the NATO members that are not pulling their weight need to pull their bloody weight in terms of the defense spending. That is wrong to sort of complain about the threat of Ukraine and then not spend some of your money towards defending yourself and Ukraine and expecting the US to carry that. No, that's not cool. But America's sort of approach of isolationism wouldn't work because the various actors that are interested in diminishing and diluting the influence of the US would continue to find ways to do that. They would interfere in elections. They would install certain narratives or, what you call sleeper agents, sort of influencer agents. We had one in the UK, right? People who are influenced or paid, right, bribed to just push a certain narrative in advisory roles to government ministers so that they vote a certain way or push forward a certain bill, right? They will continue to do that. So you can withdraw American influence, sure. Protectionism, I agree with a certain extent to protectionism. You have every right to protect certain industries because you want to ensure that your domestic workforce in those industries still have jobs, are still able to, better themselves. I think that that's very reasonable, but it's naive and shows a clear lacking of international relations understanding and just also history to think that isolationism is
Yeah.
a way forward, is a constructive policy. So we're in this difficult situation where the West wants to still be relevant and important, but one of the biggest narratives that you hear from people who are really anti anything to do with the West, NATO, US, is, well, due to American interventionism, due to neoliberal X, Y, and Z, you've made things worse. Think Libya, think Syria, think Iraq, think Afghanistan, the whole Middle East, right? American interventionism, American interference leads to more problems than it causes. And so the argument from certain American policymakers is, okay, well, we just pull out completely. But that doesn't help either. There's not one issue in the world where there are people not wondering what the United States position is. opinion on is. Even if they don't want the US to get involved, they're still curious, like, what do the Americans think about this? Because America has such a unprecedented influence around the world, right? So I think when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, I think the Europeans need to step up. I think that the Americans, obviously, I am for American presence, but I think that we also need to be realistic about the extent to which they can and are willing to support Ukraine, and whether or not we should at least be considering the idea of engaging in talks. Just because you initiate peace talks doesn't mean that you're pushing that settlement through, right? It takes time to find an agreement, right? So you can begin talks without necessarily that leading to an actual product. And I think that America's biggest threat is its internal challenges. China's obviously up there, Iran, anything like that. But until America can get a hold of its domestic polarization and political paralysis, you're going to have serious trouble in exercising your interests across the country, let alone outside. And that's why we're living in, to quote one of my guests, in the age of disruption. I believe we are in a version of a multipolar order in the sense of, the US is still the most powerful country, but there is definitely more willingness to challenge its hegemonic status in certain places. And until America can unify some of its political differences across the GOP, across the Democrats, as well as within themselves, let's be honest, there's fighting within both parties, then it's going to inhibit any ability for America to really, be an effective force in Ukraine, but also everywhere. So,
Well, and I think one part is party politics. One part of the issue is party politics, but also is the kind of unchanged Washington consensus, which in a lot of ways is unchanged by party politics. You also have to think this too. So, like in any domestic political environment around the world, most of the people's sphere of understanding is their neighborhood, is very local. So, like the international community has maybe this kind of utopian way of thinking about cosmopolitanism,
mhm.
that everyone from everywhere can gather in one place, which isn't true, and definitely isn't realistic. So, from the American isolationist perspective, like 60 to 70% of the country doesn't have a bachelor's degree. Right. That means that, these are very average people working average jobs. And so it's hard to not think about inflation domestically, you know, uh, even harder to give a damn about politics or conflict outside of the country. And remember, the budget was balanced in 2000. And then, we spent $1.5 trillion between Afghanistan and Iraq. So if you have like 70% of the country that doesn't have a bachelor's degree, doesn't have a broad worldview, has a very local worldview, then it's no wonder that a large part of the American public is becoming disillusioned and isolationist. And then again, like you said, like look at all of the U.S. intervention that has flopped, like the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan. We seized the government from the Taliban, and then we gave the government back to the Taliban. So it's like, you know, I mean, I think my personal perspective is that Washington needs more cohesive, cogent communication on where America stands on foreign policy. But we have a current president that is actually having a hard time communicating and speaking to the American public, like most presidents in the past. And then we have a former president that's just very focused on being a contentious and polarizing figure. So I mean, I'm sure you would agree, we don't hear like cohesive foreign policy strategy. And America started shredding its relationships in Africa and the Middle East like way before Biden or Trump. America's been shredding its relationships in the Middle East and Africa for multiple decades. Maybe, I mean, many decades, right? Uh, so yeah, I mean, I think the American public is concerned. I grew up in a military town, so there's 6 military bases there in NORAD.
Mm,
Yeah,
wow.
how you see hard power is through the rhetorical communication of securitization and security policy and the mobilization of troops. So it's like that's what you see in my hometown. You don't see like Ukrainians and Russians battling with each other. If anything, like from a media perspective, most countries are pretty isolated or trying to figure out ways to prevent external actors from having influence in their domestic environment. And the United States is not unique in that it does a really pretty effective job compared to what people believe at sheltering the American public from other perspectives. I mean, you hear like pretty much no African coverage in the United States. I mean, not even on NPR, which is supposed to be extremely liberal. You certainly don't hear Middle Eastern political actors speaking in American media, except maybe occasionally on Fox News if they're trying to rouse the left or make arguments about energy related policies or uh, law and order, whatever. Uh, and then, the only time that Americans have heard from Putin is on Tucker Carlson's podcast or independent media channel.
Yeah, no, I would say on the Putin interview that was with one specific goal, one predominant goal. There were obviously probably a few, but one most important was that Putin has a direct line to one of the most important stakeholders in his not just tenability as leader, but also with the war in Ukraine, which is at the end of the day, if he can get people who are fed up with the war or just fed up with Biden to galvanize to such an extent that they vote for Trump, then that ultimately means that Trump comes into office, he pulls American funding and support for Ukraine. Eventually, Putin can win because of strategical patience, which is one of Russia's biggest assets or things that they use a lot. And also just because ultimately, then by that point, Russia can begin to whittle away and the Ukrainians would have been worn down and stuff like that. So it was an awesome opportunity for him to directly speak to a group of people that he might not otherwise and already like him because he appeals to their, traditional family values, country first mentality sort of thing. So that was a really important interview for
Yeah,
Putin. And also Tucker, obviously. One other thing about the DC, having lived there for almost 5 years, like I can tell you, there needs to be, and this doesn't just happen. It's not. This doesn't just go for the US. This is Britain. This is so many places. Policymakers, people of influence, need to damn well do a better job of getting in touch with people who are not intricately involved in those areas. Right. The goal with my show and the channel is to bring people who are, non-technical, non-specialized, but are interested in an issue, in a topic, and those people who are experts in it or specialized to talk about it and then to and bring them together, right? So I was working on a format that working on the format of the show a little bit, adjusting how I'm going to phrase questions and sort of building your personal brand, you know what I mean, your personality, because you've obviously got a bit of a personality you conduct yourself with when you're online. And I'm going to start introducing more of a like, okay, but can you put it in words that I would understand or make it more accessible for? What do you mean by that? Interjecting more often because I think
sure.
I myself I'm quite nerdy and I like nerding out on the details. Like with you know what you're talking about, but average people might not have such intricate details. So even if we say the thing like hard power,
Sure.
I'm not trying to treat people like they're dumb, but not everyone, if they have an interest about Russia and Ukraine, but they just don't have time to follow it or they've only just started following it, what does hard power mean? So making it more accessible. So that's what I think people in Whitehall in the UK or Congress, DC need to do more. And the second thing is just more from a foreign policy thing, which is I think people would have less of a problem with the West if it wasn't so much about the double standards thing, hypocrisy. That is largely the only, but obviously apart from a few others, grievance that I hear people share in my comments in response to me, my guests. It's always, well, this may well be interesting, but what about what the West has done, sort of stuff. So I think that the West
Yeah,
needs to stop trying to, and I have a problem with the term West these days as well. The West is not a monolith. Are we talking about what? The Anglo-Saxon part, continental Europe, the Balkans? These are all very different parts of the West, right? But if you're talking about the West as a collective, I'm thinking mainly America, Britain, Anglo-Saxon sphere, they need to understand by preaching certain values, but then conducting yourself in ways that completely flies in the face of those values is going to leave a bitter taste for many people. And I think you want to talk about Israel and
Sure.
Gaza, and I'm not taking sides on this, but it's very clear that
Yeah.
when America talks about, upholding human rights and rule of law and democracy, and then they're vetoing anything that is a criticism of Israel and trying to push for a ceasefire, it really rubs people up the wrong way. So I personally think that whilst we obviously want to encourage, I am a fan of democracy. I like to live in the West, frankly, or more, I prefer a world which was dominated by Western than Chinese or Russian values. If I know it's a bit of a silly, extreme example, but that's sort of, if we had to use an example, you'll see more transactionality. This is the crux of my point, occur in politics. And that's why India is doing so well. Last year was a massive year for India with the moon landing, but also just hosting loads of things. And that's because India engages with almost any country on a very transactional basis. And that's where I thought some of Trump's foreign policy approaches of transactionality were quite good, right? I think if, let's be realistic, you're not going to make Saudi Arabia a liberal democracy tomorrow. You're not going to have them allow acceptance of LGBT rights, right? It's just not going to happen. But you need them because they're a massive supplier of energy for you. So instead of preaching about all these things, accept that you work with countries which are, don't necessarily align with your values. Admit that, acknowledge that, because ultimately you will probably resonate more with other people who don't necessarily like China, Russia, or others more. They just don't want the West to be saying one thing and then, doing the opposite, right? It rubs people up the wrong way. So I think that that's something that would be worth more policymakers thinking about. Again, it's obviously context specific, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but that's, I think that that's an important consideration to keep in mind.